2001, the US faced one of its country's biggest tragedies that lost a lasting impact and fear globally.
That looks like a second plane.
Terrible.
Has just
I did not
hit.
see a plane go in. That just...
It's a tragedy that most kids today are not educated on because their school curriculums are not up to date, and even then wouldn't tell you what impact 9/11 had on not just Americans, but also Arabs, Muslim-majority countries, and Muslims living in Western societies. As a result of 9/11, 2,996 people were killed. We continue to honor the lives that were lost on this horrific day, and should also acknowledge how the US could have prevented 9/11 from happening. It is also responsible for the demise of MENA and South Asian countries, civilians, and its contribution to Islamophobia. In an effort to stop more terrorist attacks like 9/11, the US initiated the War on Terror and counterterrorism operations more recently. But at what cost? More than 801,000 people have died due to direct war violence. More than 335,000 and counting civilians from MENA and South Asian regions have died as a result of fighting. 37 million people have had to be displaced from their home countries or became war refugees. And Muslims and Arabs from the east to the west have been stereotyped as terrorists because of the way the Western media portrays Muslim and Arab folks and the wars we have unethically waged against their home countries. I cannot condense decades of history and tensions with MENA and the United States that have risen since World War II. But it doesn't take much to realize that the US is not innocent, and that both our governments and our school systems have been trying to censor the harm the US has done to developing countries and innocent people outside our borders in an effort to conserve patriotism and fuel US nationalism. While 9/11 is known as an unprecedented attack that was extremely shocking to the American public and the world, the US government and President Bush at the time could have anticipated an attack like this. Considering how much the US has meddled in MENA countries in the fight for global power and the rising military domination in MENA countries, as well as America's support for Israel and its involvement in the Persian Gulf War. There actually were, in fact, two men who were aware of the growing threat to America. They were CIA Director George Tenet and National Security Council counterterrorism Richard Clarke. When the Bush administration took office in January 2001, they had both warned incoming officials that Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization responsible for 9/11, represented a great threat. The warning, however, did not seem like a big deal to top Bush officials, and by the time Clarke's anti-Al-Qaeda plan reached Bush's office, it was too late. While people have spun irrational conspiracy theories about 9/11, the fact that if past US presidents have not meddled so much in MENA affair and paid more attention to their foreign relations, 9/11 possibly being prevented is not a conspiracy theory. No president after 9/11, including Obama, who led the peak of air strikes in Pakistan that killed mostly militants but also hundreds of civilians, has taken a more thoughtful approach to counterterrorism that does not infect the innocent lives of civilians living in MENA and South Asian countries. These attacks on Arabs in majority Muslim countries have left millions of Arab and Muslim families in disarray and fear that their families will be targeted to prejudice or hate crimes, because the media believes that they are all villains responsible for all terrorist attacks. The US and other Western countries have been not doing enough to aid these families that have been displaced or became war refugees, as the immigration system has become increasingly difficult, especially when ex-President Trump placed a Muslim ban which fueled Islamophobia and alienated American Muslims in society. Muslims and Arabs continue to be stereotyped as villains and terrorists in Western media, especially in Hollywood.
I loved the 1980s when Chuck Norris used to kill swaths of my people with a machine gun in some brown bouillabaisse of a country. It was awesome to watch.
Muslims are always terrorists.
Violent terrorists.
Terrorists.
Bad people.
Shows like 24. True lies.
The last thing you will see will be your blood spraying across his face.
You constantly have this reinforcement of a very negative image of Muslims.
There was like these cardboard, angry, stock brown characters.
Muslim women are always portrayed as like the oppressed woman, the terrorist, or the hyper-patriot.
I remember when I was a kid, I would pray that like Bart Simpson became Muslim, or I'd pray that Spider-Man became Muslim, because we didn't have any role models.
In other Western countries like France, they have implemented Islamophobic rules and policies that rid people of their freedom of religion, like the hijab ban. And most recently and most devastatingly, 4 out of 5 members of a family were killed and targeted for being Muslim in Canada, leaving a 9-year-old behind in critical condition. The US and other Western nations continue to contribute trillions to the US military and destroy the lives and countries of one prosperous MENA regions. Just recently, President Biden has continued America's long stance and funding in supporting Israel, saying Israel has a right to defend itself.
My national security staff and defense staff has been in constant contact with their counterparts in the Middle East, not just with the Israelis, but also with everyone from the Egyptians to the Saudis to the Emiratis, etc. And I had a conversation with Bibi Netanyahu not too long ago. I'll be putting out a statement very shortly on that. My expectation and hope is that this will be closing down sooner than later. But Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory. But I had a conversation for a while with the Prime Minister of Israel, and I think that my hope is that we'll see this coming to conclusion sooner than later. Thank you.
While simultaneously continuing to allow the Israeli government and IDF to oppress Palestinians. 9/11 has had a lasting impact on the world. America has worked hard so that our borders are more secure and our people are more protected. But does that mean that the millions of Muslim and Arabs' lives that have suffered are worthless just because they are outside our borders? No, and they shouldn't be treated as such. With that, I'll leave a quote from one of the most recent prominent American political activists, Angela Davis, from the book Freedom is a Constant Struggle, who said the so-called war on terror has done inestimable damage to the world, including the intensification of anti-Muslim racism in the United States, Europe, and Australia. As progressives in the global north, we certainly have not acknowledged our major responsibilities in the continuation of military and ideological attacks on people of the Arab world.